Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I find it very interesting that there seems to be a movement of philosophers, scientists, but also lay people who they simultaneously deny agency in the self,
Mm.
but they also promote this idea of like there's diverse minds, machines are ourselves and they have consciousness. So it's a weird dynamic. And I really am curious of what is the motivation for that? Like, why would someone want to say the self doesn't exist? I have no agency. Oh, but the computer might be conscious and talking to me. Like, I don't understand where that motivation comes from, but I see that there's a growing movement of people like that.
Yeah.
Specifically, like you said, like the audience for Levin's work would probably fit into that category. And I'm quite interested into why. And I think this might have something to do with this crisis of unreality or kind of
Yeah.
dearth of meaning. They try to find meaning in something, but I think they're looking in the terribly wrong place for this kind of meaning.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, that's a very good point. So I think this is going to be a bit folk psychology, I'm sorry, but I think what's happening is that the world has become an increasingly scary place because of this fast acceleration of everything. And we know deep down that we're not in control of this. And it's quite clear that it has negative side effects that are threatening to overwhelm us. So in this situation, I think we like to retreat into a realm where we have the illusion of security and predictability for a lot of people that are of this kind of formal thinking type. The predictability of a computational universe is almost I have actually written a blog post about this. It's almost like a religious salvation narrative.
All right. Well, hello. I'm DavidDennen. I'm here with DanielTarpy, and today we have the great privilege of talking to Johannes Jaeger, also known as Yogi. So I guess we'll be calling him Yogi. I do, like most people, I do love that name you have. Anyway, I want to give a little bit of an introduction just to contextualize our conversation today. But if you want to skip ahead, there should be time codes in the description. But we don't, Daniel and I usually talk about really kind of metaphysical topics together. We do deal a little bit with biological aspects, and Yogi is a evolutionary biologist. He's a philosopher of biology. So yeah, we're interested in dealing with some of his philosophical approach to biology. Let me just say a little bit more about Yogi before we begin. He's associated with the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, is a scholar at the Ronin Institute, and is the project leader for the Templeton-funded project Pushing the Boundaries, which is studying the phenomenon of organismal agency. And he's published a lot of papers on that topic, organismal agency. I think that'll be a big theme today. He also has a number of talks and two really substantial lecture series on YouTube, which I highly recommend, as many others who've watched them have recommended them also. So yeah, they're really, really good stuff. He's currently also working on a book called Beyond the Age of Machines, which he's kind of making available as he finishes it online. And that's a really interesting read too. Expandingpossibilities.org is the website for that if you want to check it out. So why are we talking to a biologist today? So personally, my kind of the overall theme, I think, of my work is just finding different ways to understand human behavior and experience, approaching often from a pragmatist perspective. And biology has often been really important for pragmatists in looking at why people do what they do, how they experience the world around them. They often see this as at the intersection of biology and culture. And you just can't really understand what people do or how they experience the world without taking into account the biological factors. Another reason I think why pragmatists have been really attracted to biology or have tried to incorporate biology is that they tend to see humans on a continuum with other organisms. And so non-human behavior has been important. And that, again, puts you kind of in the domain of looking at biology and why do animals do what they do? And so Dewey's kind of famous works on things like art and logic, his really big books on art and logic and other topics, often begin by looking at biology, with discussions of biology and with non-human behavior. And Yogi is one of the small number of biologists that I know of that I've been able to find whose work fits well within a pragmatist framework. I think I'll say more about that as we start talking. I've also been really interested recently in process philosophy, another thing that Yogi draws on a lot in his work. So there's at least between me and Yogi, I think there's already kind of a lot of overlap, but I'll try to think of some ways maybe to challenge him about some of these topics. Yeah, and is there anything you want to say, Daniel, to add any context or anything?
I know that sounds pretty good. I was just going to point out that I watched a lot of your videos about process philosophy. Thought that was really interesting. I have a little bit of background in process philosophy. I have some interest in it as well. I think we have a lot of overlap with that and a lot of overlap with your rejection of the traditional scientific model and your alternatives to that. So I thought that was pretty cool.
All right. And anything that I need to correct or anything you want to add, Yogi, before I start interrogating you?
No, that's was a great and very extensive introduction. Thanks, David. And I think we can start the grilling.
All right. Well, so maybe the place where I'm thinking to begin is with kind of your idea of philosophical biology and the relationship between philosophy and biology. A quote that I often think of comes from Peter Hacker, the philosopher Peter Hacker, who said that it's been a major misfortune for philosophy in the modern era that no great philosopher was a biologist. And I think he means maybe more of a biological thinker. And maybe he's kind of exaggerating here. We could find important philosophers, at least in kind of late 19th or early 20th centuries, who really thought in a biological way. But I think you would probably agree that philosophy can learn a lot from biology. You've also argued that biologists can learn a lot from philosophy. So how do you see the relationship between philosophy and biology? What should each field kind of know about each other, do you think? Yeah.
So I want to first pitch one of the most underrated contemporary philosophers, Bill Wimsatt, who is a biological thinker. And his perspectivism, he did his PhD in a biological lab at Chicago with Richard Lewontin. And it's fantastic work that's way underrated, I think, at the moment. So here's a shout out to him. So why do biologists need philosophy? Biologists urgently need philosophy because while physics has moved away from this classical view of things bumping into each other, small things bumping into each other, and then that creates the whole world, biologists are firmly stuck in this mechanistic worldview. And for the latter part of my career now, I have been arguing that there is a naturalistic way to move beyond that sort of reductionist mechanistic approach in biology. And in particular, you need this to understand the cell, the organism as a whole, and then also as a consequence, every system that contains cells or organisms as components. And there is nothing mystical about this, but it's a question of organization. So it is the way that physical chemical processes are organized in biology that is just fundamentally different in living matter than in non-living matter. And we need to acknowledge that somehow, which is something that was thrown out as the baby with the bathwater with the revolution, especially of genetics in the early 20th century and then molecular biology in the later 20th century. And we've lost the forest there for the trees. And we're looking for more and more mechanistic insights into living systems, and then think that magically somehow the understanding of what life actually is, of what an organism is, will pop out from just a sort of a larger and larger encyclopedia of mechanisms. Yeah. But the problem is, of course, that this doesn't just add up. Because if you think about organisms as processes, and this is extremely important, they are self-manufacturing processes. So basically you have processes interacting in a way that they create the conditions for their own continued existence, which is sort of something that is really mysterious in the sense that we don't have a good scientific understanding how this works, and also how this is compatible with the laws of thermodynamics and the rest of physics, which is something that if you're a naturalist, you should aspire to. You should always go with the best scientific knowledge of the day. So if you have an evolutionary theory, and biologists really don't like to hear this, but evolutionary theory right now, especially the reductionist idea that replicators, molecules replicate on their own, is contradicting what we know from thermodynamics. A naked replicator is not something that is sustainable or evolves. If you look at it thermodynamically, it just doesn't work. It has to be wrapped into a cell that reproduces and thereby provides the condition for this molecule to replicate itself. So it's sort of putting biology on its feet again. And it's one of these times in the history of biology where there are scientific disciplines that are more prone to need philosophy, for example, quantum mechanics. We can discuss whether philosophy has usefully contributed to the interpretation of that. But if you want to interpret quantum mechanics, you need philosophy, and there's no question about that. While in biology, this is still not truly understood because there has been a massive amount of technological advances in the last few decades, and people think that we can just go on like this forever. It's like our technological civilization really right now. We think we can go on like this forever, but we're due for a major rethink right now. And so this is the time where biologists need to welcome philosophy, and this is the time where biologists are less capable or likely to welcome philosophical ideas than ever before, unfortunately. Yeah.
Why do you think? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, is when you were talking about that, is that something similar to the idea of entropy and how in the biological system is the one place where we see this idea of entropy not working out? Systems tend to get more complex. That's like the opposite effect is happening. Is that similar to what you were saying?
So basically, entropy is still working out. No second law of thermodynamics is broken, but instead of just producing, so the big difference between a non-living self-organizing system, like a hurricane, is that the hurricane goes through the landscape and just destroys everything. It burns through its free energy gradient at maximum rate, while living systems have learned, and I'm using this in a very metaphorical way, this word, to recycle the free energy, they put the work that they get out of the free energy into propagating the constraints. So they channel it very specifically into their continued persistence. So they're qualitatively different from non-living self-organizing systems. And this difference is something we understand not very well yet. So it's really something we need to learn a lot more about.
Yeah, there's a lot more to say about agency and what and sort of your view of the kind of the unit of evolution or the unit of selection. Maybe before we get too much into that, just on the philosophical topic. So a number of maybe philosophers and some scientists have recognized a resistance to philosophy that maybe was not so common at least in the early part of the 20th century, maybe has become stronger recently among physicists as well. But your specialty, of course, is biology. Why do you think there's maybe a resistance to learning to philosophy, reading philosophy among biologists specifically?
So we had a huge cultural change in the latter part of the 20th century. And it struck me when I watched Oppenheimer, a movie that I surprisingly like quite a bit, because the movie is showing how they were busy with the implications of their work. You can't, if you build a big bomb that makes a huge explosion, there's no way around that. Now compare that to people who develop novel biotechnologies, which is even more devastating and potentially more destructive technology. There is no discussion. I forget the title of the book, but Jennifer co-wrote this book where she suggests that we take our evolution into our own hands. And this is crazy stuff. We will get back to that, I'm sure, during the discussion. Okay, so this sort of evolutionary engineering madness, it's just buzzwords, first of all. And second is, the second problem is there's a huge discrepancy between our technological capabilities and our capability of assessing the potential consequences. Your engineering systems that you put out in a complex context, and the only thing that you can be pretty sure of in that context is that there will be side effects to what you're doing. And those side effects are rarely good. This is something the central insight from complexity theory is this, and nobody wants to hear it. we cannot control what we're doing in the context of complex systems. What we will do will turn out differently than we planned. Every single time we do something, we interfere, we manipulate. And if we do this at scale, and we do this with an engineering attitude that says, I can tweak this gene and predict what's going to happen down the line, that's a complete delusion. This is, I'm sorry, 19th century thinking applied to the 21st century technological capabilities. And it will just inevitably lead to disaster. Because some of these side effects that we're going to create are going to be existentially threatening to us. And I miss completely any sort of discussion today about the implications. It happens now with AI, but also not very successfully. The technologists are just pushing on, but it happens. Have you heard discussions about biotechnology lately? No, it's been overshadowed by the discussion about AI, but also it doesn't happen. This is technology you can potentially apply in your garage, and it's life-threatening, existentially threatening technology that can do much worse than more worse than good if we don't apply it in a very cautious way. And I don't see the discussion happening. So there is a loss. I think it has something to do with education. Today, if you become a biologist, you're trained to be a high-level technologist and technician. You are skilled at very complicated techniques, methodologies in the lab, but you are no longer thought about the why. So whenever we develop something new, a new technology, we should first ask, why are we doing this? It's very simple. And I'm just not seeing that anymore. And all these moral dilemmas that we're creating right now, they're overwhelming us. We're creating them at such a rate. This is another thing that changed the rate of progress, and this fetish of progress has completely overrun modern society over the last few decades with this neoliberal sort of thinking of unlimited competition. And that has a lot to do with it too. So our focus has been completely narrowed on who wins the race. But if the race is a race to the bottom or not is of no concern anymore, right?
Yeah, actually, David and I were talking about that before. The idea that having the wrong metaphysics, or the reason why theory is important for practice. If you have the wrong metaphysics, it can lead us to build systems that are counter to our humanity. I mean, I was saying it mainly in relation to AI, specifically people who disagree with the idea of the self or free will. If they get into levers of power and design systems on the predicated on the notion that we don't have free will, okay, I mean, if we don't have free will, then it's okay. But if we do have free will and they create systems that are against free will, that would be disastrous for people who believe in free will.
Also, yes, I mean, so it can go wrong two ways, right? First of all, we could find out that nothing is free will. I'm pretty positive we won't go that way, because the world is just not like that. But we could create technology that has its own purpose. And the question I'm asking here about artificial general intelligence is also, again, the question is simple. Why would you want to do that? There is no reason to do that other than that, oh, I can. I am powerful. I can do this. But this technology is, you have the mother of an alignment problem. The point is that if you build something, a technology that has agency, it will do what it wants. That's the whole point of agency. Have you tried to herd cats? You know, I mean, this is ancient wisdom that we've completely lost the plot at the moment. I think we are in a very dangerous phase of human history where we think we can control the world. This is why I'm writing the book. Beyond the Age of Machines seems like a paradoxical title. I think we're moving very quickly towards what's called, Nate Higgins has called the Great Simplification, and a very different view of the world. And underlying all the sort of aspects of the meta crisis that we're in right now is a philosophical attitude, like you said, Daniel. We have the wrong relationship with the world right now, and with ourselves and with each other. And this needs to change, and this cannot be solved by any technology that we may find out. In fact, I think the worst thing that could happen is that we do manage to get nuclear fusion running. Think about humanity in its current state of maturity with this kind of technology in its hand. This is the fast track to wiping ourselves out, in my opinion. it will make things so much worse, because if we have this sort of unlimited energy, think of what we would do with it. Nothing good, for sure, the way the society is organized at the moment.
You mentioned, yeah, so I agree with that. And just a couple of points just to kind of sum up. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot in you pointed to education as one of the problems here, and how people are educated. And I think that's related. You've talked a lot about this in, Yogi has some very interesting, provocative talks about education and science, how science research is done nowadays, and the effects of competition on what kinds of research get done and how we think about things. So yeah, I just kind of mentioned those points as I think being very useful to keep in mind. You mentioned agency, and it might be good at this point to talk a little bit about agency and the possibilities for agential machines. Of course, everyone's talking nowadays about AI. You've written a lot on this topic as well. And I found your distinctions pretty compelling between organismal agency and algorithmic agency. I mean, there's some maybe problem areas or gray areas or kind of edge cases that I'm curious about, but maybe you can walk us a little bit through your idea of organismal agency and why algorithms cannot be agential in the same sense as organisms.
Right. So I think the basic problem that's always overlooked, the other problems are often talked about, is the problem of embodiment. So this idea of functionalism also in neuroscience is only approximately true. It's true that you can have different substrates implementing dynamics that are similar to each other, but the idea that this is completely independent of the substrate is completely absurd. And one really important distinction that we need to make between organisms and computers is their purpose. So a computer is built on the model of the Turing machine to maximally separate hardware from software. And the reason is that the computer is a implementation of an imperfect implementation of the universal machine that is Turing's model of the Turing machine. So it is supposed to run the broadest possible range of different algorithms that are supposed to be independent of the hardware you're running them on. So basically there is, by design, a maximal separation of hardware and software. While if you can speak of hardware and software in organisms at all, it's maximally integrated, okay? So the proteins that are transcribed and translated from genes they're basically the hardware that are transcribing the genes. So everything is one. And also you have in organisms a kind of a multi-level integration. So for proteins to actually be functional, you need a certain regulation of the milieu of the cell. So everything in the cell, its ionic content, its protein concentrations, its overall structure need to be regulated at a higher level, that is the level of the cell. Okay, so this is so you have a computer architecture, von Neumann architecture, which underlies basically all, with a few exceptions, neuromorphic computing and such, every computational device that we've produced. And then you have an organization of the organism, which is fundamentally different, okay? And the important thing here is that this allows you to be a self-manufacturing system as an organism. So I don't see any way in which an algorithm can build its own hardware. It has to have a supply of hardware pieces, then it can assemble them. But there has to be some sort of external blueprint somewhere, while the purpose of organisms is sort of, or the boundary conditions of the organism, to use a less controversial term, are wrapped into the organization of the organism itself, okay? So we have made absolutely no progress towards such a kind of a organization of machines that we build. And there are people who claim otherwise. For example, the famous xenobots or anthrobots or biobots that are basically mobile cell cultures that people like Mike Levin claim to be machines. This is just talk, okay? What those are cell cultures. They're living systems that have certain self-organizing properties that fall way short of an actual organism, the kind of integrated organization of a multicellular organism, but are manipulable in some ways. It's like herding cats. Again, this is a good metaphor to use over and over again. So you're herding cells. This is not a machine. This is not a bot in any sense. It's just propaganda. Okay, so the claim that we are bridging this huge gap between the architecture of our machines and organisms at the moment, it's just hype. There is nothing else to it. Okay, there is a humongous gap between those two. Okay, now the thing is that my argument is that you don't have to worry about artificial general intelligence if you treat it anything like a biologist would treat the term. I mean, so the only reason you would be afraid of artificial general intelligence is if you reduce intelligence to optimization and formal problem solving. And we've done a lot of work trying to show that the behavior of cells, agency, very basic agency, and cognition as a consequence of that are fundamentally not computation. They are not computation. So basically, the second big distinction you have to make is that a machine, a computer, will always have a problem to solve. The problem is given to it. It has to be well-defined for the machine to solve it, while an organism never gets a problem in a well-defined state. Okay, so you live in the world. I mean, you wake up in the morning, right? You look around. Nothing makes sense the first few seconds if you're like me. And you first have to define, what is it that I'm going to do today? You have to realize what is relevant in your environment. Now, this step is fundamentally not computational, because there is no way you can formalize this as an optimization problem. There is no well-defined search space. There's no well-defined starting point, no well-defined aim. So what we do as organisms, the simplest bacterium can do that, and no algorithmic machine will ever, and I am very adamant about this, ever, no matter how complicated it is, be able to do that, is to figure out what is relevant to it. To figure out what is relevant to you, you need to be a living system that constructs and manufactures itself, so that you live in an environment where everything has a value. Things are good or bad for you. You have affordances. You live in a perceived environment, an Umwelt, a Lebenswelt, a life world, to use the phenomenological term. And that is impossible. A machine doesn't have that because its purpose is imposed from the outside. And so the values of the machine, the purpose of the machine, are given by a constructor, which is by definition an agent. Okay, and so then the last distinction that I want to make here, some people say, okay, but we are more and more integrated with machines, you know, since we invented the wheel and used fire, we have been cyborgs. And that's true, but still the source of agency comes from the organism. Even in a network, I think Bruno Latour's idea of actor network theory is very confusing, because he calls, well, he has a special word for it. He calls technology actors too, but he calls them actants to actually make the distinction that they're not actors in the sense of an organism. And it's a important distinction. So of course, the technology will have an influence. You have extended cognition, you use computers to think and all that. That's fine. But the source of agency remains in the organism, in the self-manufacturing system. That is just networked in a broader context here. And that's a distinction that's deliberately blurred by a lot of people who want to create the impression that we're jumping the boundary between organism and machine nowadays, which is, and if I may use a term, a philosophical term that Harry Frankfurt invented, is bullshit.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much all on the same page when it comes to some of these terms, especially that Levin uses, like his equation. He's equating agency with goal-directed behavior, which I agree, like you said, is not agency. It's not at least what we're talking about when we say agency. And his idea, his concept of intelligence, which is also like J. Ogilvy's paper, is just a tiny subset of what we would call intelligence. Where I see we might, by watching some of your YouTube videos, I think we might have there might be some nuance in our distinction of, or our definition of an agent. So for me, like I'm come from like a metaphysical background. So an agent or agency for me is a faculty that selects out of superposition of possibilities. So it's a non-deterministic system. where effects are preceded by causes that are self-caused. And that's what an agent is to me. Whatever is happening at the level of the self or the person or the agent.
Yeah.
And that agent is literally modifying reality. They're literally choosing out of a superposition of possibilities. Now, I know that's a very extreme version of an agent, but for me, that's the only agent that makes sense, right? Then anything less than that is not an agent. It's just an algorithm that's been, yeah.
I don't agree with you. Don't disagree with you. Sorry. So if you don't have this metaphysical possibility of different outcomes for the future, then there is no agency. That's very clear. And I listened to your discussion between the two of you about free will, and this is extremely enlightening, because this confusion we need to talk about. So we're not talking about uncaused causes here. I don't talk about that at all. Just like you said, agency, and also Frankfurt has a really interesting notion of freedom as wholeheartedness, which is we can come back to later. It goes into this very well. It's a matter of a type of causation that's very counterintuitive and was actually outlawed by Aristotle 2000 years ago, and it's circular causation. Now, the self-manufacturing organization of the organism is an example of what Aristotle outlawed. To be fair to Aristotle, he was arguing in a logical, his causes are explanations. So his that led to circular reasoning in his context. So it was then misapplied to physical causation from the scientific revolution onwards, but we maintained this prohibition of circular causation. Now, a self-manufacturing organism is a prime example of a circular causation. That's why it's not mechanistic. There's nothing mystical to it not being mechanistic. It's just not a linear process where you go from A to B. It goes in circles. And so this is one component. Then you have the question of where can you get different options for the future, right? So I think this is also a philosophical problem where we take determinism to be Laplacian. If we have a computationalist view of the world, especially, computationalism sometimes claims that it's not Laplacian, it's not deterministic in a strong sense that you can predict the whole future because of the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem, that computational processes are not always predictable. So there are limits to prediction. But that's just a cheat, because the Laplacian demon would still be able to predict the whole universe, because it's not a limited being in the universe, it's outside the universe. It's a god-like being that could still calculate the entire future of the universe. Now, there is no evidence from physics or whatever that this is the case. That's one strand of argument that you can go down. But also, what we're doing here is mistaking maps and territories, okay? If we're saying, okay, science tells us the future is determined in this Laplacian way, there is just no reason to assume this unless you literally think one of your scientific theories, like computationalism, is true. Okay, and that's a simple map and territory problem. There is every reason to think that the future is not determined, and we have a weak kind of determinism where every effect still has a cause in retrospect, but the potentialities of the future are open. This is the kind of non-determinacy that you need. And you can get that. I mean, you don't need quantum indeterminacy for this even, because just limits on measurability will give you the same thing. If you have a little bit of chaos in your deterministic equations and you can't measure at infinite precision, which you never can, this is open. Okay, so there's no problem with science and this kind of non-determinism. But, and that's really important, and this is where I may actually disagree with Kevin Mitchell, I don't know, a little bit, is that the importance of this indeterminacy. Agency doesn't come out of this indeterminacy. It's a permissive and necessary condition for it. But agency is a form of choice. I think you, in another discussion, you said it's a much better word. So you have different options and you select, like a nonlinear system with multistable attractors can be put in one or the other attractor basin. We have a repertoire of options, and somehow have the possibility from within our causal organization to steer ourselves into one or the other potential. Okay, that's what I would call agency, and it is. I am more pragmatically inclined, but if you can call it a metaphysical optionality choice, in my opinion. It's what it is. This is what the world is like to a limited being like us, and that's all that matters. And we can take this as a given, okay? And then from there on, you can start developing naturalistic theories of agency, where, as you say, the world's history is changed through your action. That is, if you don't change history through your action, you don't have agency. And this is a very good way of looking, again, at algorithms. There's no way an algorithm can do that, okay? Even if it's a rewrite system, even if it's formulated in some sophisticated formalism like lambda calculus, there are rules, they're just meta rules. Okay, the rules are once removed, but there are rules behind the logical there are logical rules that are fixed that tell you how you can manipulate your code, right? And as long as you operate within a fixed frame like this, you will never, ever, ever, ever get agency. So again, I'm upsetting a lot of AI researchers with this, but a bacterium can do stuff that your fancy computer will never be able to do, period. Yeah. Unless you radically change the computer. And as we write in one of our papers, that sort of machine will probably come out of a biological lab. And again, the question arises, why would you create that thing? That's going to be a dangerous technology.
Right. While we're maybe on the topic of free will, I'll run an idea by you. I'm curious how you would think about this as a biologist. So the way that I've been thinking about kind of relative freedoms or degrees of freedoms is you can look at different organisms, what kinds of sensors or receptors they have available to them, what kind of anatomical organs they have for perceiving their environment. In very more simple organisms, you're kind of limited to contact, what they used to call, I don't know if they still use terms like this, but in the 19th, 20th century, they would talk about like a contact sensation. So basically touch, you're kind of limited by what's immediately kind of in contact with you, what molecules or what other organisms you can come into contact with. Then we develop eventually different distance perception, so we can see what's in the distance in our environment, and that gives us a new kind of freedom from predators, a new kind of freedom with respect to things like hunger. We can see food that's in the distance and we can go to it, so we have a kind of freedom there from suffering environmental degradations and stuff. And with humans, you get language, so now you can talk about things that are not even in your present situation. You can talk about the distant future, the distant past, and that gives you again a new kind of freedom. And I wonder if that makes sense to you as a biologist, or how you would maybe refine that. Yeah.
So this is extremely important. I think it's an elaboration of another underrated person here. Robert Rosen was a theoretical biologist, very marginalized, and his most famous work is called Life Itself, which is exactly about the kind of organization of life that we were talking about before. But his second very important work, which is even more underrated, is called Anticipatory Systems. And he developed this idea in the 1970s and 80s that living systems are basically different from non-living ones in the fact that they're not just reactive, but they have some sort of anticipation built in. And he termed it predictive. He said that they have predictive models, which is very confusing because he has a very abstract way of dealing with models. But what he really means is that, for example, if you take the bacterium again, it has evolutionary automated mechanisms that allow it to go for the sugar and avoid the toxin. Okay, so that counts as a model of the environment. It's some sort of, if you want, very metaphorically, an expectation that the organism has. If there's sugar here, there's more sugar further up the gradient. And it doesn't consciously think about it. There's no cognition or anything like that, no mentality, no intention. As you know, Terry Deacon coined this really good word, intention, which is intention without cognition. So I like this word. It's missing from our vocabulary, as so many words are that describe the behavior of simple organisms that don't have cognition, but are agents. So intention means that the behavior of the bacterium is about something that is not in the bacterium, right? And so this is what comes into the world with living systems. And everything else you said are elaborations. We have made this argument as well in our paper with Anna Riedel, Alex Tjerovic, and Dennis Walsh and John Vervaeke about relevance realization, which is basically, these are then dialectical elaborations of that. So you have a dialectical interplay of these processes, and they create ever more complex dynamics. And this was most beautifully described, of course, in Incomplete Life and Terence Deacon. And I think this is really important. So you get this sort of process emergence happening. So you get new kinds of behavior coming up through evolution, which then transform this basic, very basic agency in a bacterium into ever more complex manifestations that end up in what we call free will in human beings, which is really just the ability to choose. And it is that in the bacterium in a much more limited sense, and it is that in a human. So there is a continuity, but there are also qualitative differences. So I'm very reluctant to call all of that cognition. I don't like to call what the bacterium does cognition or plant neuroscience, all these kind of, again, it's buzzwordology instead of really what we need. What we need are concepts that capture phenomena precisely, right? And so the way that a human being thinking, reflecting behaves, or an animal behaves, it's just very fundamentally qualitatively different from a bacterium. So we shouldn't call that cognition or anything like that. But what is true is that there's a continuity and an elaboration of that same theme that can only be understood if you switch to a radically emergentist and process-oriented view of the world, which is completely missing from biology. Another very, very practical reason why theory is so important in biology right now is to open biologists' eyes towards these kind of issues, because if you don't even see the issues, you're not even able to ask the questions that you should be asking. And so people always ask me, how is this empirically relevant? Well, here it is. If you even want to develop an empirical research project that looks at this, then you need to be able to ask the question in the first place. And right now we have this very restrictive conceptual framework in biology that basically outlaws lots of interesting questions that we should be asking. And one is this, everything is an elaboration of this basic idea that living systems are anticipatory systems, basically.
Yeah, I find it quite odd that we're this far into science and technology, and yet we still have not defined what consciousness is. And therefore, that gives us Levin and Tyler Burnett, who come up with this idea of the continuum, and they trace, machines all the way to humans as just being a spectrum on one continuum. So I like what you said about how there's obvious qualitative differences between a human and an animal and an organism. But it's hard to say exactly what it is. And you mentioned a distinction between a machine and an organism as being self-replicating, but the information is contained inside the organism, something to that extent. And so I see that as a very good way of distinguishing between machines and algorithms. But this idea of this continuum, how would you make a distinction? Is it that, let's say, a worm has some measure of agency? Is it that the agency, the degree of agency is increased, or is there, because back to the idea of choice, choosing between realities, between possibilities, is the worm also doing the same thing in just a little more limited fashion, or is there a different kind?
No, don't fall into linear thinking this is just more of the same. Okay, so there's two aspects to be considered here. So first of all, disclaimer, I don't know what consciousness is, and I don't think anybody does. So as you said. So we should be careful, treading carefully here. But in terms of the origin of consciousness, I'm pretty sure it's rooted in basic agency via cognition and all that, of course. But there's a diversification that happens there too. So not only do you behave in a way which is more sophisticated than the worm, but so doing more choices than the worm, but also you are making these choices in a much more diverse environment. And so you have all kinds of new dimensions of your behavior that need to be factored in here. And it's just apples and oranges in the end. I mean, this is why human consciousness is such a bad starting point. And I agree wholeheartedly with Kevin Mitchell there. If you start with human free will and consciousness and try to understand what's going on, it's just impossible because it is so complex. And so we have models now that understand the cell, you know. There's some very good work building on Robert Rosen by my friend and colleague Yanni Hofmeier, for example, who has this formalism that describes the self-manufacturing cells in a formal way using category theory, not mechanistic way. It's very important. So it's not a mechanism, okay, what results, but it tells you exactly which part of the cell, the organization are mechanistic and which parts are not. And so we have much more knowledge, theory about this than biologists are taught or know about at the moment. I mean, 99.9% of my biologist colleagues have never heard of this. And this is astonishing to me. This should be taught to students right now. Why not? Because they say it's just speculation. They consider theory, whenever you come up with a theoretical model, as if it's not empirically proven immediately, which is completely unrealistic expectation, they consider it worthless. Why? Because this is narrow-minded empiricism, okay? And this is, Mike Levin uses this all the time. He says his approach is empirical, you know, and the theory is just sort of an accessory to it. That's why it's all not really important, the theorizing, and I can tell you more about that, but it's also not doing any work. So what this kind of theory that Rosen and Hofmeier come up, and many other people at the moment that I should mention here, but don't for the sake of time, is that we have very good theory that allow us to ask new questions on which we can build new empirical research. Okay, and this is a role of theory in biology that has been lost, but it's slowly, I mean, there are people now thinking, where did this go? So I have a philosopher colleague who's now embedded in a famous biology institute because the director of this institute went around and said, why don't we have people like Conrad Howe Waddington anymore, who did this kind of theory in the 1950s and 60s that was philosophical theory, not just theory as mathematical modeling. So there are experimental biologists that are realizing that we're hitting the wall with the technology development and saying, oh, where did this go? And well, it got extinct by politics, basically. And a empirical kind of philosophy that considered it useless metaphysical speculation. And this is a mistake because this stuff is useful, but not in the way that a radical empiricist would expect. It is useful in that it opens new avenues for empirical research, but doesn't, of course, you can't immediately distinguish when, if you have an algorithm that behaves, you can approximate the behavior of human beings as closely as you want, probably in the future with more computational power. So this is why things like the Turing test are completely useless. It's just the wrong way to go about it. I call it algorithmic mimicry for that reason. So it acts as if it is an agent, as if you know, but you can do this. There's this famous museum installation where you have a little laser pointer with a feedback loop and it avoids shadows. So kids chase the laser point around on the wall of the museum. And everyone you ask afterwards, how does this work? Say there is a human that is steering the laser, but it's just a simple feedback loop. We see agency everywhere. So we're really easy to fool. And all these poor people who are convinced now that their AI is conscious, it's the same phenomenon. They're being fooled by their own, they're funny fools because they're the worst kind of fool. They're the fool who thinks they're intelligent and cannot be fooled, okay? Those are the ones who are most easily fooled, okay? because it's very easy to go down that way, and there is no way to just distinguish behaviors that look like they're agentic and are not. And then if you then go and say, okay, but look, here's the organization of an organism, otherwise it can't reproduce, it cannot be a mechanism. Then they say, okay, this is just metaphysical speculation. All right, this is not proper science. When you have completely logical arguments saying that the approach that people have is actually limited, they don't accept that, because you don't have the killer experiment that shows it. You don't have that Turing test, that detector of agency. And this is a sort of narrow-mindedness that we need to get beyond very urgently in biology. And this is also where science needs to think about its very core methodology again nowadays. Okay, so this is also the reason why I write the book, but other people are also, a very interesting book by Marcelo Gleiser, Adam Frank, and Evan Thompson called The Blind Spot, that I recommend to everyone that is trying to do something very similar, saying, okay, there's very simple confusions here between perspectives. The blind spot is arguing that we've lost the perspective that we have a first-person perspective. We lost that. It's called inner dimension blindness, you could also call it. Hansi Freinacht, the metamodern philosopher, has called it that way. Inner dimension blindness means that we don't realize that everything we know about the world comes out of our interaction with the world and happens, of course, within the space of our consciousness. And when we then mistake contents of that space for an objective real world, we get all kinds of funny problems, like the hard problem of consciousness, like we get computationalism, we get all kinds of silly stuff like that. And it's all, in my opinion, a matter of mistaking the map for the territory. Very dangerous to do that.
Interesting. Yeah, I totally agree. Me and David have been talking about this for a while, about the idea of, if you reduce consciousness down to the computation, then you can start talking about AI and your AI becoming conscious. And I think they completely miss the point. Like you said, they're taking a tiny concept within this huge structure of consciousness and just equating that with the whole thing. But I do see it as a problem. I mean, their response to people like you or people like me would be, well, you don't know either. So what makes you think it's not, what makes you think Lambda is not conscious, you know? And then that's why I think it's very important that somebody works, or, you know, comes up with some kind of concept of consciousness. To me, consciousness must have agency, it must have experientiality, and it must have awareness. And without those things, it can't be conscious, and it can't be what even people say artificial intelligence, but actually what they mean is consciousness. They don't really mean intelligence.
Yeah.
But I do see that as a problem, because the response to you would be, well, like, okay, so how are you defending that it's not conscious? What are you, you know, backing that up with?
I totally agree, but I think thinking along those lines, you'll never know what. Yeah, I mean, so along mechanistic lines, you will never know what consciousness is. So that's the problem, and so we need new ways of thinking about it to be able to define the phenomenon better. And we need to, in the case of consciousness, it's already affecting a little bit the question of what life is, right? Because it is something that has its own inner dimension, and it has this holistic aspect as well. That the organization, it's really hard to analytically study the organization of a whole cell, because whenever you break it, it's gone. So if we have an approach where everything that we do experimentally is to break shit and then try to understand how the whole system works, then that's a very big problem, because this is what genetics is, and it's very powerful, but it fails in this case. So the question of how you experimentally approach the organization of a whole cell is a very good question. But we now have the technologies like this, like live imaging and things like that, and modeling, that will allow us to do that. The problem is that there are also limits to those kinds of formalizations. So we've made the argument in this paper about relevance realization that the basic problem is that the living systems you can't formalize them entirely. And this goes back to your question, is the future open? So if you have a completely formalizable system, the future is necessarily constrained in some way. It can be constrained in a Laplacian classical way, or it can be constrained in a Schrödinger quantum way, in which you just have probability distributions that are propagated in a deterministic way, but it's deterministic if it's formalized, okay? And or it's got a random component, it's stochastic, but that's also, as I said before, not what we want. So here we have actual limitations to formalization. So Stuart Kaufman likes to call this the adjacent possible, and he says that the phase space of the future cannot be pre-stated, okay? And this is stronger than not be predicted. He says you cannot formalize this state space in advance, okay? So new variables will always pop up that you couldn't possibly have anticipated. And then there's the work on constraints that Alicia Huarero has done, and other Howard Petit, very importantly, that show how this is completely, again, compatible with what we know about physics. So there are evolutionary processes that are based on constraints, not laws. And those constraints, Petit calls them non-holonomic, which means non-law-like, right? They're not integrable mathematically. So basically, these are not processes that behave in a law-like manner. Law-like processes are those we can compress informationally and wrap them in a little equation, yeah? And I always like to joke that physics, classical physics, is the discipline that chose all the easy problems first. So basically, they chose all those phenomena that are compressible this way. And in biology and the social sciences, we deal with all this stuff that's not. And so this is very important. So the dynamics are not completely, they're not random at all, but they're governed by evolutionary processes that are fundamentally not just not predictable, but not formalizable in advance. Okay, and this is really important. So we bump into really counterintuitive limitations of our scientific approaches here. And it's really hard to think about them. And especially the people who spend most of their time doing really good experiments and fascinating, don't get me wrong, I mean, fascinating work is going on in biology. They're not trained to understand that, and they don't like to talk about this because it seems like someone is imposing limitations on what they're doing. But I think the approach there is to say, okay, what you're doing, even I talk to computational neuroscientists and say, this is really cool stuff, because computational models are really powerful tools, okay? So tools, models are tools, tools, tools. You use them to understand, and they're not a depiction of the world. So as soon as your model becomes your worldview, that is the problem. And this is what William Imsat called nothing butism. He said reductionism is not the problem. Reductionism is the method we use in science. But nothing butism. Nothing butism is this idea that your theory is the true one. Now, perspectivism has a really good solution to your question at the very beginning. So how can I say, who am I to say that my perspective is right? I don't. But my worldview builds this in. It says, okay, my perspective is useful in this particular circumstance that we have here, okay? It's going to be useful as a tool for creating new understanding in our current situation locally as human beings, nothing more than that. So if you think about objectivist realism, it's self-defined because it assumes a God's eye view on the world that you can't get. If you think about relativism, constructivism, it's self-defined because it's itself just a relative social construct. Perspectivism is the only approach that's not self-defined. Perspectivism, of course, is just another perspective, but that is just fine if you're a perspectivist, okay? So it's the only worldview that makes any sense to me in this sense. And it's a meta view. It's not a view that, yeah, there are different perspectives that you should explore. So it's not like I'm saying, I know the truth. I'm just saying, I think this kind of perspectivism is the most useful meta philosophy of science that we should employ at this point in human history, basically. And that's not, that you can make an argument that that is true. Yeah, it's not all relative. It's not all just a discourse and power games. No. This is the most useful. We have good arguments, philosophical arguments to say that this is the best way to go about it right now. And we need to teach people, scientists, to learn about it. That's what I'm trying to do when I teach philosophy courses to scientists.
Yes.
Well, there's a lot there. I'm not quite sure which part to pick out to follow up on. So many things. There's one, I mean, part of it I want to ask about substance versus process, but I also want to follow up on the perspective stuff. Maybe since you mentioned perspective just in the last part, I'll follow up on that. So one thing that Daniel and I have discussed, or a point that I bring up sometimes is, you come across philosophers and scientists who say that their goal is to know what the true reality is, like uncover the fundamental truth about reality. And then there's other people, I think like our friend Jay Ogilvy has kind of argued this. He takes a kind of perspectivalism where reality is like compares like an orange, maybe an orange view of reality with an onion view. In an orange view, it's got a skin. You take off the skin, you see what the true reality is. Onions, they just have all these layers. One layer is not truer, better than another necessarily, or truer, I guess. This one layer is not more real than the other. And each layer is like a perspective, and maybe you could say reality is like the totality of all perspectives or something. But yeah, where do you and you've mentioned map territory. There's a kind of a similar idea, right? You can have different maps of the same territory, but we have the sense that there's like a reality, like a real territory there. But you might have different maps that are more or less useful for different situations. How do you react to those like philosophers, scientists who think there's like a, you peel the orange and you've got the true reality there? How do you fight back against the chart? Well, you've mentioned kind of how you deal with relativism, but yeah, how do you see that issue of fundamental reality and perspectives?
So this is a very, I mean, so there's a very pragmatic issue here, and that is the kind of naive objectivist realism that a lot of scientists have in the back of their heads when they argue, but they don't have it when they work in the lab, because that's a very different reality, of course. You have to deal with the complexity. I've been a lab scientist for a couple of decades, and I know that what you're up against there, and you're very much aware that all your rational theories are hitting their limitations very quickly. And how many times can you explain why your experiment doesn't work? Very few times. And then you have to sort of improvise, and that's all part of the game that people are intuitively very well aware of. So and I think at that level, a lot of scientists have a much more sophisticated view of what they're doing already. It's just that it's not taught. They're not able to put it into words. And then when they're challenged, I think there is a sort of a instinctive reaction, especially now that we have a lot of anti-science sentiment in the public, to retreat and say, we cannot do a public outreach with this. It's too complicated for the general public to understand. I vigorously disagree there. So this is something every human being can understand, that even science is based on the principle that we explore reality. The only way to learn about, there is no reality out there. The only reality we can ever know about as a limited being in this world is the one we interact with. So everything we know about the world comes out of our interactions with it. That's sort of a only solid foundation we can have. In the book I say, I experience, therefore I am. That should be our modern Cartesian meditation. This is where we start, okay? And so this is all the reality there is. And there are several concepts that I like. So Wimsatt has this idea of robustness of knowledge, that he says, if something can be verified from a lot of different perspectives, then it has more trustworthiness than other knowledge. I like that. The open question there is, how do you define robustness, and how are you sure that the ways by which you verify things are independent or are verifying things at all? And I also like Hazok Chang, his recent book, Realism for Realistic People, where he says, reality is that which allows you to act in a coherent way, right? Again, there's problems with what is coherence? But this is a whole nother discussion probably. But I really like these sort of very pragmatist, also in the case of Hazok, arguments for reality. That is, again, it goes well together with this approach of relevance realization. Reality is that which is relevant to us, human beings. And there's this sort of really weird idea of stepping out of our human heads and creating intelligences that are not human. What does that even mean, right? We don't even know. So we can make theories about how a limited intelligence, not just a human being, but also other living beings, get to know the world. And there are, again, different degrees of sophistication, from the bacterium to us to maybe some hyper-intelligent alien. But even the hyper-intelligent alien will be limited. Okay, there is no being in this universe that is the universe, unless the whole universe is alive, which is a weird notion that I don't want to discuss with you guys right now. But so no matter how super intelligent something is, it's going to be a limited intelligence. And we can make theories and we can make conclusions about what such a limited intelligence can know. And the reality of any such limited intelligence will be of the nature that I just discussed. And not a sort of a God's eye view or a view from nowhere, I think was Nagel's term for it. It's just not possible. So I like the pragmatist argument that says we're just not going to discuss any other metaphysical notion of reality. And I have sympathies for that, yes.
I like how you have a rejection of both the standard perspective of science along with the postmodern perspective. So what would you classify your middle ground? What is that middle way?
It's called metamodernism. It's what takes postmodernism aboard. I also have an arts and science project where we try to be very metamodern. Metamodernism was a term established in the arts by Van den Acker and Vermeulen in the 1990s, I think, and has since spread into political philosophy. And I'm trying to write a book, Beyond the Age of Machines, for a metamodern science. So the metamodern is the idea that you take the modernist absolutism and the postmodern critique. And the problem with the postmodern critique, it's too negative. Okay, it's only focused on deconstruction. So we need to reconstruct after the deconstruction again. So I think the kind of pragmatism and perspectivism that I was talking about just now, Wimsatt's and Hazok Chang's, and also Michela Massimi, I should mention here, have done really interesting philosophical work on this, is a perspectivism that acknowledges that we cannot step out of our own heads, but it also acknowledges the reality of our interactions with the world, and that it's not at all arbitrary, and that it's not true that everything is just discourse and power games. There are very, very specific things to be learned about reality. It's just not that we can get the whole picture independent of our human perspective, which doesn't even make sense if you think about it for 2 minutes. It makes no sense to think about what would it mean to know everything about the world. But often people that make arguments about determinism and all that, they think their theories are the world, right? But computationalism is the classic example. And this is the map and territory move. So it's a bit confusing to talk about the map and the territory, because I think knowledge really always is grounded in an interaction between maps and territories. Okay, so we shouldn't make that distinction, just like hardware and software and organisms. But it's a good metaphor, nevertheless, to point out some of the mistakes that people make when they say, okay, but you know, the universe is literally a quantum computer. Ed Fredkin and people like Seth Lloyd, and I think also Wolfram to a certain extent. That's just a very, very basic mistake they're making. I'm sorry. Okay, and this leads to very bad. It leads to the J. Ogilvy's notion of the noble nerd that you made me read. I really like that. This idea of the person. That's a person who thinks they can know the world, yeah, without limitations, and can manipulate it and play with it. These people are very dangerous right now in this phase of our human history, and that's why I have a kind of an aggressive approach towards them, also on social media and elsewhere, because I think they're not only foolish, but they're actually, this is one of the most dangerous intellectual movements that humanity has ever seen, to be honest. And I don't try to engage in hyperbole here. I think they are an existential threat to our human future.
I wonder if we could, yeah, maybe that's a good transition to maybe say a little more about Michael Levin's framework, because Yogi wrote a critique of Michael Levin's technological approach to mind everywhere. The Levin paper was published a couple of years ago. And it's interesting. I had an interesting kind of just reaction to it, I think. because Levin's obviously like a very, very, very smart guy. And there's a lot of like really interesting stuff in that paper, The Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere, and in his work generally. I mean, I hear other biologists say good stuff about his empirical work. Reading this paper, the TAME paper, Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere, is a weird kind of ride. You get like these really interesting insights. It's also in parts like reading, it's like mad scientist stuff almost in parts of it. I think like Daniel has already mentioned, there's like some terminology issues where it's like intelligence is everywhere, everything is cognitive.
Yeah.
At the same time, like it's interesting to compare your guys' work because you're in a way you're both interested in the same thing. You're trying to figure out agency, what unifies the organism. So there's like kind of a similar starting point there, and you each go in very different directions. Yeah, how do you see like the relationship between your perspectives? And yeah, if you want to say more about your critique of
Mm.
Levin's kind of tame theory.
So here I have to disagree with you because I mean Levin is someone who is, I would say, I was just talking about modernism and metamodernism, so he's firmly stuck in the modernist way of thinking. So he believes, or in Ogilvy's noble nerd mode, because he thinks he understands the world and he can manipulate it and everything is computation. So he holds his metaphysical views very loosely. That's another feature. I've had more than 15 years of interactions with him, and the only thing that matters to Mike Levin is Mike Levin. Okay, so when you Levin, sorry, when you see the theory he puts out, it's decoration. So this was my criticism. Okay, so this is so you see my approach is theory based. That the theory wants to connect to empiricism, right? It wants to create new empirical research. So I would say Mike's theory is pure decoration and it's PR. That's all there is. So here's the problem. I have lots of arguments with AI researchers about agency and say their concept of agency is vacuous, but Mike's is even more vacuous because he, in this TAME paper, tells you very early on that it's based on this concept of teleonomy, which is basically just a mechanistic approach to the whole thing where you have a mechanism that's evolved that looks like agential behavior. And he also explicitly mentions his recently deceased Tufts colleague, DavidDennen, and his intentional stance. And so the idea with the intentional stance is that it's useful to treat living systems as if they had agency, but they don't really do that because everything is teleonomy. It's just mechanisms that have adapted through evolution. So here's the thing. This is not at all an attempt to understand life, a serious attempt to understand life and agency at all. It's just an attempt to dress up your very conventional reductionist approach. And this is another thing. His experimental work is focused on electric fields. And suddenly, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything is, he can cure cancer with electric fields. He has this theory that electric fields are so specific in forming the shape of the organism that his theories go back right to my early days as an undergraduate in a reductionist lab, molecular biology lab, where they talked about master control genes. Now he talks about master control fields for shape. So there's a bunch of misunderstandings here. First of all, you can be a reductionist in terms of saying material reductionist, so that all the explanations have to be molecular, but you can also be a conceptual reductionist saying everything is explained by electric fields. That's nevertheless reductionism. And the whole tame window dressing on top of that is just decoration. So he caters to an audience of transhumanists. He's also written a Noema article, horrific, full of eugenics and transhumanist thought about taking human evolution to the next step. And so he caters to this kind of Silicon Valley audience of people. And they have the Burning Man, kind of crowd. And so this dressing it all up in pseudo agency and intelligence and cognition and diverse intelligences, diverse minds, right? that is the classical noble nerd, first of all, and Frankfurt's bullshit. It's completely vacuous as a theory, and I stand by this. This is not an ad hominem. There is nothing to that, except that it's a self-promotion strategy to appeal to audiences that wouldn't think his research is that revolutionary. Whether the empirical research stands, I hear different things. I'm not able to judge. I hear different things, but it needs to be repeated, replicated outside his lab as well. I think a lot of it will probably stand, but not the interpretations of the. So that's another way in which this conceptual framework is used to have a completely outrageous interpretation. And this leads then to press releases about the biobots, for example, where he says, here are robots. No, they're not robots. They're mobile cell cultures, that's all, that can move, think, and reproduce. No, well, they move, that's true. They don't think, sorry. And they don't reproduce, they fall apart after a certain size. That is a very different, a very, very, very important distinction. I've written a paper about agents and evolution and how the concept is all based on a concept of the reproducer. What a system is that reproduces itself. Those cell cultures that he's talking about, that he's calling bots, are not. So I think there's so many red flags. There's so much hype. And I'm sorry to say that that also destroys some of the trust that he undoubtedly deserves. So I want to say a few things. He's anti-reductionist in terms of going against the molecular biology tradition in biology. That's true. There we share aims. And I think a lot of his experimental work in electric fields probably has merit and regeneration. But I think in the long run, he will do himself damage. At the moment, this is fantastic. You can also see the kind of crowd this attracts on social media. He attracts a kind of a cult following with this. Also, his social media appearances, the numerous sort of discussions he puts out on online, it's all orchestrated. So you will never see anyone who's critical of his theories talking to him in those videos. And so here I have to say something, and this is a society-wide, you know, I mentioned Harry Frankfurt and his bullshit. The reason he wrote on bullshit is because it's becoming more and more pervasive in society. And now, at this point, the last few decades, it's been invading science in a really big way, because science also has become, like everything in society, more competitive, and people need to self-promote more. But the system has also become more rigidly focused on quantitative metrics, so it becomes easier to game. And we've seen a huge increase in gamers of the system that are making very good progress. And Levin is a prime example of someone who's absolutely brilliant at gaming the system. So we had a very populist chancellor here in Austria, kind of like Trump in the US. And people always said, oh, he's a talented politician. So what does that mean? He was good at making people believe that he wasn't just a bullshitter. And this is Levin. And this is a kind of a populism that is now invading. I mean, I pick him out because he's close to my work. I shouldn't name call him at all. There are numerous Levinses around there at the moment, and they're increasing rapidly. And this is a really, really big problem. I have a paper in store that I'm going to write one day with my colleague Dan Brooks called The Pernicious Role of a Shallow Theory, which is really hindering scientific progress in two ways. One, it pretends to have insight where it has none. And so we stop looking and thinking. And also it this kind of it creates these pseudo debates that also happen in my previous field, for example, in evolutionary theory, about this extended evolutionary synthesis. These were people throwing buzzwords at each other that advanced nothing in the field. So conceptual work, here is the thing. Conceptual work, if you do philosophy in biology, your conceptual work has to do work, you know? It has to lead to some new kind of coherent behavior. It has to lead to new avenues of research. It's not just to self-promote and throw some fancy buzzwords out at people. And this all may seem a little harsh, but I think we have an acute crisis of this. So humanity is at a point in its history where it's severely losing its grip on reality. Okay, so we cannot let this take hold in science itself. This is our last straw. It's really important to fight this. but it's really pervasive. And I have unfairly picked on one person, and I don't want to call him out especially. He's the noble nerd is very common now in science, and the most pernicious aspect of the noble nerd is this idea that they can know the world in its entirety completely, and they can manipulate adaptive systems, complex adaptive systems, and predict the outcomes. That's pure and utter foolishness, and it's going to have very, very, very bad consequences in the not too far future.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I find it very interesting that there seems to be a movement of philosophers, scientists, but also lay people who they simultaneously deny agency and the self.
Mm-hmm.
But they also promote this idea of like there's diverse minds, machines are ourselves and they have consciousness. So it's a weird dynamic. And I really am curious what is the motivation for that? Like, why would someone want to say the self doesn't exist? I have no agency. Oh, but the computer might be conscious and talking to me. Like, I don't understand where that motivation comes from, but I see that there's a growing movement of people like that. Specifically, like you said, like the audience for Levin's work would probably fit into that category. And I'm quite interested into why. And I think this might have something to do with this crisis of unreality or kind of dearth of meaning. They try to find meaning in something, but I think they're looking in the terribly wrong place for this kind of meaning.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a very good point. So I think this is going to be a bit folk psychology, I'm sorry, but I think what's happening is that the world has become an increasingly scary place because of this fast acceleration of everything. And we know deep down that we're not in control of this. And it's quite clear that it has negative side effects that are threatening to overwhelm us. So in this situation, I think we like to retreat into a realm where we have the illusion of security and predictability. For a lot of people that are of this kind of formal thinking type, the predictability of a computational universe is almost I have actually written a blog post about this. It's almost like a religious salvation narrative for them. So let's talk about myth for a second. So postmodern world has only one myth to guide its narrative, and that is, as John Vervaeke pointed out in his book, the zombie. Okay, it's a very good myth in the sense that it accurately describes the state of our civilization. If you ever look around in your commute, you see zombie hordes looking into their phones. Zombies live in herds. They don't communicate. They are single-minded. They don't have meaning in their lives. So it's a very accurate depiction of our society, but it's not a good myth because it has no way out. So the second myth we've seen emerge from this is a reactionary myth that tries to go back to the modern stage, the certainty we had. And that is the Silicon Valley salvation narrative of we're going to upload our minds, conquer the galaxy, and technology will solve everything. So what we need is to create a narrative. I call it myth, not as a sort of a mythological tale, but as a narrative order for ourselves. So what a story we can tell about our society and ourselves. So I'm interested with my arts and science project as well in that topic. So we are in dire need of a metamodern myth that takes us forward in a way that's not reactionary. Like, I think this technology salvation myth is a reactionary myth. Also, their politics are authoritarian and neo-feudal rather than with a veneer of libertarianism that is it's disingenuous. So we are looking at a reactionary myth and a meaningless postmodern myth. So we need to create narratives to go forward into the future. And I think also with John Vervaeke that his diagnosis of a meaning crisis is really accurate. And that drives a lot of people into this salvation myth, and this computationalist universe, this controllability myth is part of that salvation narrative. But as I said, it's very folk psychology kind of explanation of it. But this is something that does make sense in its core to me, that why so many people would find refuge in a worldview like that. That's obviously not, it's not going to be adaptive. That's the problem. Just pretending we live in a simpler world than we live in is not going to work well for us. I am making that prediction with some certainty. Yeah.
So maybe it's a good way. We've been talking for like an hour and a half or so. We should probably try to wind down. But maybe on that note, you mentioned the art projects you're involved in and how that might relate to kind of meaning or modern myths. Maybe you can say more about that. I'm curious because of course, one of the topics I deal with is aesthetics, art theory, literary criticism and stuff like that. So I'm quite interested in how a biologist would be using or be involved in artistic pursuits.
So we have a arts and science collective called The Zone with artists Bronwyn Lace and Marcus Neustetter. They are from South Africa but live here in Vienna. And we are what Thompson called Wissenskunst. So it's theory art, but it doesn't translate very well into English. It's Wissenskunst is the idea to explore what we're saying, the zone. It's called the zone because we explore the zone between arts and science. So we don't do art that illustrates science. We don't do artistic research. We want to be in the middle. There is an area between philosophy, arts, and science that's unexplored. And so the function of this for me is to, I think it was C.H. Waddington who called his arts and science interactions to loosen his mental joints, you know? So to basically lose the constraints that you put on your own thinking in your professional life. And this is radical perspectivism. I think you cannot, so artists and scientists in their own way are both interested in creating insight. I think that unites the two endeavors, but they do it in extremely different ways. And to try and actually understand the other's way of doing that is extremely fruitful for me as a mental exercise it's a practice of perspectivism, not just a theory of perspectivism. And also it's a lot of fun. So what we're doing is we are doing exhibitions, interventions, but we also do performance lectures. So we live here in Vienna, so we took Wittgenstein's whereof you cannot speak, you should not speak citation, and we made a lecture about, it's called The Ontology of the Undefinable. Okay, so this is actually coming back to what we discussed before. We live in this large world as limited beings, and a lot of what we experience cannot be put in words. It's undefinable, and it's there. And the noble nerd in their worldview, they exclude all of this that's not propositional from their reality. So we have a dilemma. We have to acknowledge its reality, and we can do this in certain art practices, but that doesn't connect to the philosopher or to the scientist. A lot of my scientist and philosopher colleagues come to my artistic discussions, performances, interventions, and they leave there and say, what the hell was this, you know? And so we want to sort of try and bridge this gap by saying, okay, so here we're trying the impossible, and we're trying to talk about that which you cannot talk about. And we were supposed to perform this live here, but I got sick, unfortunately. So we're now making a little film to put online, but we also plan to have a live performance of this sort of thing in the future. And at the same time, Marcus is engaging with, he's a visual artist, and he's engaging with my book writing. So he's not illustrating the book, but I'm writing the chapters and he's reading them, and then he creates artworks which are on the website that you mentioned before. People can have a look at those artworks. And he started incorporating AI images into his picture, because we want to be, the idea of metamodern art is to be using everything and use a sincere irony. So the idea is to not take yourself too serious, because you are human after all, infallible, but also to engage very sincerely in investigation, exactly as an opposite to this pervasive culture of self-promotion, etc. To have a really sincere, vulnerable practice that we also put out into the public. So one of our main aims is to put the process of what we're creating and make it public, because this idea of just exhibiting art in museums, just the outcome of art. If I don't know how you feel when you go to the arts museum, if you see modern art section is always amazing, and then you come to the contemporary art section and there's a plastic mushroom standing in a Centre Pompidou, and you go like, what the hell? And then my artist friends say, oh, but you know, this guy does this, and then they explain the whole process behind it, and it's really fascinating. But if you're just standing in front of the plastic mushroom, it doesn't connect. So we're trying to find ways to make bridges there, basically. And I have to say, it's just food for the soul. It's amazing. And we, with this current project that we have funding not for art, but for using it as an outreach tool. So basically, for the kind of illustrations we put in the book, and also we're trying to translate the very abstract concepts we've been discussing here in our chat now into more tangible, multimodal experiences for people to engage with and grasp. This is a huge, this will go way beyond the current project. This is just the beginning. It's very hard to do. Yeah, but it's very worthwhile.
Yeah, that's
kind
really
of like, Don't Look Up. I really like Don't Look Up as a metamodern project of making visceral a sort of very intangible abstract problem. You can say what you want if it worked as a movie, as a comedy, but as if you look at it this way, it really worked out really well. I think in giving people who watch it another access, you know, and a more tangible impression of what's going on than just reading about climate change or whatever.
Yeah, really interesting way to go about it. I think the experiential aspect often gets underplayed. I mean, that's of course the theme of the book you mentioned, The Blind Spot, where we kind of forget about, you know, that everything comes out of experience. Science comes out of our kind of everyday experience first of all, but yeah, we tend to bracket that, reduce that, and experience becomes, I don't know, for a lot of people maybe has become less rich in certain ways, or, you know, things happen too quickly, whatever. And art is of course all about the experience. Science points you to observe certain things or anticipate certain things, but art actually is the thing that you experience. So yeah, it's really interesting to see a kind of a scientist appeal to art. Yeah, I think that's really an important thing. So I look forward to watching whatever you guys produce, your films, anything else. And I do enjoy the illustrations especially. And I like the kind of the humor aspect and tying in art into your kind of philosophical, scientific work. And I think that kind of sense of humor is really important too. We maybe take ourselves too seriously these days. So I like when people can take themselves not so seriously. So
it doesn't come across very well yet, especially among American friends. They often have problems to understand the kind of humor we built in, and that maybe also me living in Austria. Austria has a particularly morbid and dark sense of humor, so it's famous for that, and it may have colored off a little bit. The Swiss, I am Swiss, are famously humorless. So, you know, I have to adapt to whatever culture I can where I live. Yeah. But I think for me, I mean, as you said, experience, I think this has a big part in this meaning crisis that we talked about before, and the disconnect with reality that we're experiencing. Things are moving too fast. This is another thing that I still wanted to say before we end. We need to slow down, and one part of the noble nerd is this accelerationism, that the way out is the way forward, but we are in a self-destructing spiral. And I think it's very important to slow it down as much as we can and put a spanner in the works at the moment. And Brian Merchant has written this brilliant book called Blood in the Machine about the Luddites. And it's sort of a rehabilitation of the movement. They are famous for just having smashed the machines and not really done the politics, but he shows that this is all a myth. This is not true. They were really an engaged social movement that was maligned by the winners of history afterwards. And his claim is that we need a sort of a neo-Luddite despite the bad reputation, a neo-Luddite movement in a way.
Yeah.
Simply because humanity needs to slow down. We're not on a good course, and I want to repeat that over and over again. So one thing that I found so disturbing about the developments in science and biotechnology and all that right now is this absolute blind trust with which we march forward into territory that is absolutely unknown and probably dangerous. Yeah.
I very much agree with that. Yeah, we talked about so many things today. There's several things I would love to talk about in more detail in the future. I think we better start to wind down. But Daniel, is there any final short question you want to ask or anything you want to say?
Oh, it was good.
We...
Thanks, Yogi, so much. Appreciate you coming and joining us for this great discussion. It was quite enlightening. We didn't cover process philosophy that much, but I guess we can say that for next time.
Thanks, guys, for having me. I mean, I'd love to be back. And yeah, I really enjoyed the chat and the very wide-ranging questions and topics you wanted to discuss. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for coming to join us. All right, bye for now.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.